When the face of college football for the better part of the last 2 decades retires, you dedicate an entire live show to him. The biggest questions will get answered from our most plugged-in sources. How Nick Saban changed the sport from a former Alabama player. How he revolutionized talent acquisition and scouting from someone who worked in the building, in the recruiting department. And who is Nick Saban? From the guy who literally wrote the book on him. We'll also hit on what's next for Alabama, what's next for Nick Saban, and what's next for college football. All that coming up right now. Nick Saban retires and we react. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Emily Proud. And before we get rolling, a reminder to hit that like button and make sure that you are subscribed to the 247Sports YouTube channel. Let's get you up to date on the latest in this ongoing story of Nick Saban's retirement after 17 seasons at Alabama. Our Bama 24/7 senior writer John Talty reports alongside Matt Zenitz and Mike Rodak that Nick Saban cited age and health issues when explaining retirement decision to the team. The team was also told the school hopes to have a replacement within the next 72 hours. As it pertains to that, we have to welcome in John Talty of Bama 24/7, who has been all over this. And John, we've had 24 hours to just really digest this news. So what is the latest that you're hearing coming out of Tuscaloosa?
I think that's still a lot of shock, Emily, honestly. Even 24 hours, I think, and you're seeing some of the things that Nick Saban has said to ESPN and other places coming out of this, that, you know, he came down really to the wire, that even at 3:55 p.m., he was still wondering what speech he was going to give to the team. You know, we had reported last night that he was still interviewing coaching candidates up until about 3:55. So he was someone who was going through his normal progression, his normal day, up until the very minute that he decided that it was time to retire. So I think people are still trying to process that, still trying to understand his decision and what's next. And of course, you know, for what we do, the attention quickly turns to coaching search and who the candidates are going to be and all that. But I think there's still a lot of shock and attempts to process the loss of someone who's been just such a dominant presence in college football for the last 20 plus years.
Yeah, someone who does not really have time to process that is Greg Byrne, the Alabama athletic director. He said that the next time that he speaks publicly, it will be to announce a new head coach. And it sounds like that we can cross Dan Lanning off the list after the epic video that he posted on Twitter. So what do you know right now about this ongoing coaching search?
Yeah, the three names that I've gotten the most on so far are Washington head coach Kalen DeBoer, Florida State head coach Mike Norvell, and Texas head coach Steve Sarkisian. That's from talking to, you know, various people in the industry. Those are the names that we've been pointed to keep an eye on. That's not saying that it's definitely going to be one of those, but those are the names that people think to keep an eye on. There's various connections for all of those guys, either back to Alabama or why they might be a potential fit. But those are the names that are being bandied about the most right now, that people think could be potentially one of those three guys.
I remember you told us yesterday that Byrne likes to move in silence, and so we probably won't hear a whole lot about this until he is ready to announce the next guy. I think what's interesting about this, too, is Saban was so much more than a coach. He was the CEO of that program, and he had a lot of sway at the university as a whole. So, John, now that he's gone, how will that power structure among the higher-ups, the boosters, and the new head coach evolve at Alabama?
Well, I think what's interesting is that, you know, he has said that he's going to keep an office in the football facility. That's a little unique to me, and I wonder, you know, just how involved he's going to be moving forward. I think it's always interesting when a guy is as much of a legend as he is to kind of be hanging around. That can be challenging for a new coach to come in, to not only have to replace the greatest coach ever, but also that he's still kind of in the building. You've seen other guys, especially I think like Coach K, Roy Williams, you know, some of them have kind of backed off to give the new guy some space. I'm sure he'll want to do that, but that was a little interesting to me. But yeah, I mean, the joke has been for a long time that, you know, Nick Saban might have a boss, but he doesn't really have a boss just because of his stature and importance in Alabama. And I think whoever they hire, that'll be a different dynamic between him and athletic director Greg Byrne, probably more of a traditional relationship. Whereas, you know, again, those two got along well, they worked well together, but I think it was very clear to everybody in that athletic facility, everybody at that university, and everybody in the state of Alabama that Nick Saban was the one who was really running the show and was able to get a lot of what he wanted. And, of course, justifiably so. I mean, won 6 national championships there.
Yeah, that will be an interesting dynamic to monitor, him keeping an office there at the facilities. You'd think that he would make use of that $17.5 million Palm Beach home, but maybe he will split time between those two places. John, you got unprecedented access when you wrote the book on Nick Saban that came out in 2022. So peel the curtain back for us. Who is Nick Saban, the person?
Yeah, I think in some ways he's misunderstood. I think some of what you see is accurate, but I think there is more to him than just the guy who we've seen, yell and scream and break headsets. And I think he's done a good job over the last few years of starting to let people into more of that. Lots of players and coaches have talked about how funny he can be. He's got kind of this dry sense of humor and likes, make little jabs and little jokes to people. And he's a guy who, cares a lot about his team, cares a lot about his players. I think there was a time where we treated him as almost like a robot who was uncaring and didn't only cared about winning. And that's really not who he is. He loves the guys he's coached. And you hear stories, and I've talked to a lot of these guys over the years, someone who might have played for him 35, 40 years ago, they reach out to him, hey, can I pop by Alabama to see a practice? He always goes out of his way to do it. He'll still write recommendation letters for guys who played for him 30 years ago. I mean, he just has such a bond with his players. And kind of once you're inside his circle, you're kind of in there for life.
All right. You said he's keeping an office at the facilities, and I can't imagine a world of football without Nick Saban somewhat in it. So what do you think is next for him?
Yeah, he's talked about TV. And so I wrote about in that book that, about a decade ago, he considered potentially, retiring at that point and taking a job at ESPN's College Game Day. That's something that I think is always going to be an option for him. ESPN is very interested in him. He's great on TV. He's appeared on Game Day over the years. He does a weekly spot on Pat McAfee, in which he's very entertaining. So I could see some sort of component for him in which he does something with ESPN or another television network. He has multiple car dealerships. I think he'll have opportunities should he want them to be a CEO of a company just based on his incredible organizational skills and business acumen and all these different things. So he's got a lot of opportunities to do different things. Knowing Nick Saban, this is not the guy who's just going to drop off the map and do nothing. I think he's going to want to keep busy. He's for so long had structure. And so he thought about leaving years ago. The number one thing he said that was holding him back, he's like, I need to feel like I'm part of a team. So I think he's going to try to find what that is that feels closest to leading a team, being part of a team, to kind of fill up that part of himself.
He's not a guy that I think is good at sitting still, so certainly needs to fill the voids somewhere. John, thank you so much. It's been a busy 24 hours for you, and will continue to be busy as this coaching search continues, but we appreciate you being here today. You can check out more of his work at Bama247.com for all the great intel regarding the coaching candidates and, of course, the fallout that continues from this major news. And there's a deal going on right now. We got 60% off annual VIP memberships. Highly recommend you get that. That's where all the good, juicy information comes from. They have you covered at Bama 24/7. We're going to bring it here on the desk because I have two very interesting fellas next to me. You know them as national college football analysts Smoke Dixon and Cooper Petagna, but both of them have a connection to Nick Saban. You, of course, an Alabama alum, didn't play for him, but were recruited by him, so some interesting stories there. And then, Coop, you were in the building in Nick Saban's recruiting department back in 2014, so we'll start there. What was it like being in that building and in that element?
It was pretty incredible. It was my first opportunity working in college football and working around Coach Saban, Lane Kiffin, Kirby Smart, Mario Cristobal, Billy Napier, all these guys that have gone out and had tremendous success, and a big part of that being Coach Saban. I think when you look back on it perspective-wise, it's hard to galvanize a program in a building, in a locker room, and have everybody fall in step. And that's exactly what Nick Saban was known for. We lost the game in 2014. We lost to Hugh Freeze and Ole Miss, and it felt really like a funeral a day after. And then that Monday, guess what? You're back to work. That 24-hour rule. I think he doesn't get enough credit for the psychological aspect of getting his team locked in, what type of motivator he is. He's just a tremendous presence, and the way that he kind of led by example was pretty tremendous. And guess what? I was an intern. I was a nobody in that building, but just watching him operate from afar, you'll learn a lot just to see the way that he interacts with people. And there was always a standard in that building, and it started with doing your job, and everybody knew what their role was, and that's something that I took with me the rest of my career.
Well, being a 17-year-old young guy out of Maryland, I was recruited by Coach Talty. And Nick Saban was the head coach at Michigan State at that point. And, it didn't work out for us because at that point he was going in one direction, I was going down south. We wanted to stay up north. But when I got in, after my career finished playing, I got into coaching. And I always went down to the University of Alabama just because I'm an alum, and he always invited us to come back. One thing they did, he had an open door policy for if you were an alum or you played for him, you come on back in. And the thing that I gained so much from was going down there every spring and being able to sit in the back room of that table and just get so much information from a guy that just wanted to make you better as a person, but also as a coach. He coached the coaches on how to coach, and he was a detail-oriented, structured guy. And I left that 3 weeks, every spring I used to go there. Leaving those 3 weeks, I felt like I had 3 years added on into my coaching career. And then I would go back and work those camps. And one thing that if you ever worked a Bama camp or attended a Bama camp, you got taught how to play the game the proper way from the mindset, mentally, but also physically. He taught technique. And if you're a high school coach going in there and you weren't teaching the technique that he instructed or he installed that day, he would probably come over and tell you, get out the way, and I would do that. And my last story of working the camp is we would always write evals on every single player. So if you were in charge of the Bama group, the gay group, whatever group that you were part of, you wrote an individual, exact, to the point eval and gave the young man, if he was 7 years old or 17 years old, 3 things to get better at. And I never believed that Coach Saban read all those evals until Coach Alseri sent me up. Was like, you know what? Come on up there and watch him. He read through every single one. If it was 1,500 kids or 5 kids, and he signed it every single time. And there was one time one guy wrote a BS eval, just jumbled up a whole bunch of crap. And he came out there, found that young coach and said, hey, listen, is this what you would give your son if he came to a camp that wanted to get better? This kid just paid $300 to get better. We don't do that at the University of Alabama. And that's the guy that I know.
It says a lot. I mean, you talk about the evaluation process of it. The Saban Way is what we call it, right? I mean, you saw what that process was like working under him. As a former general manager, you know what it takes to do what you have to do to get it done in the sport of college football. I'll start with you. How revolutionary was Nick Saban's process for talent evaluation?
Well, what Nick did was Nick took the NFL format in terms of having a personnel department, backroom that you were a part of making sure that every kid got watched, eval, graded until it got up to the position coach. So he's the first one to have that going. Now he also created a high school relations job for a high school coach, but he also did a lot of off the field things. When those barn doors closed, those guys were coaching. But also he created the rehab for former coaches. The ones that got fired, you'd go down there and you'd see 6 to 7 former coaches on that back wall as an analyst position. The ones that everybody's clamoring for right now, Nick created that in the totality.
Yeah, you talk about like revolutionizing the process. He is the process, right? I started at Alabama and I went to Cincinnati and I went to Michigan and I had an opportunity to work at a lot of great programs. And the reason I got those opportunities maybe wasn't so much about me, but it's because I had that Alabama logo on my chest. That's what the power of that meant. Everybody was looking for a little piece of that cake, right? So it doesn't matter when I worked in Ann Arbor under Jim Harbaugh, who's got a national championship now. They wanted to know, what is Nick Saban doing, right? What is the process? What does this look like? And Smoke talked about it, the detail orientation, the way that he goes about his business, the execution, the ability to have people who make a lot of money and have those people strip their ego at the door and come in and fall in line and say, hey, we're going to be part of a team today. That's kind of what made him special. His fingerprints are all over the game. I worked at 6, 7 different spots everywhere, drew from Alabama, and I'm talking about working in the Pacific Northwest with people that have never met Nick Saban before, but they want to know how he did it. How is this a guy that continues to have not just success, sustainable success over 17 years? So you talk about a guy that has completely changed the sport forever. A lot of people will talk about coaching. A lot of people will talk about player development and relationships, and they should. He doesn't get enough credit for how great he was in terms of being the all-encompassing player personnel mind, looking at it from 30,000 feet and saying, hey, this is how this puzzle piece fits fits when we're trying to put a team that can contend for a national championship together.
And it wasn't just setting a standard and being good at having that eye for talent, right? It was going through meticulously and telling you exactly how to scout a player, how to build a scouting report, all of these things. I mean, how much did you learn while working under Nick Saban?
Everything. I'd say my football DNA was crafted, pretty much 90% of it, at Alabama. And Smoke talked about it, 3 weeks, gaining 3 years of knowledge. And I don't want to be over dramatic, but that was really me in my football career. Everything past that point was supplementary. Alabama was my baseline. Everything I have learned about football, analyzing football, evaluating, talent identification, those baseline principles come from Tuscaloosa and come from Nick Saban. And a lot of those conversations you have today when you're sharing knowledge, when you're talking to other people who say, hey, I want to get started in the game, where do I start? Well, that's where you go back to. It's always a baseline. And there are a lot of baseline principles that I think Nick Saban has taken from Bill Walsh, from Bill Parcells, a lot of the greats in the game, Bill Belichick as well. And we've been really, really fortunate that when he got into the game in 2007, really a few years after when he brought Ed Manowitz from the Miami Dolphins, he's completely changed the game. You talk about the opportunities that's created for a lot of people like me and Smoke and a lot of other people out there. It's all because of him.
You don't have a general manager or DPPs in college football if Coach Saban's not the guy that's putting that together and having a personnel department. And everybody wants to say, well, you've seen him rip coaches on the sideline. Well, if you ever sat in a meeting with Coach Saban, with those guys around the table, and even the back wall guys, he instructed those guys on how to do it. Case in point, I had a story, quick one for you. They're going through spring ball, and the defensive line is getting ripped apart in the run game. And instead of Coach Saban going in saying, oh, Chris Rump, your guys are getting beat up. He said, okay, Coach, what can we do to make sure that you guys are seeing these run fits daily? How can we get you better? Because if you and your guys aren't playing better, the rest of us are getting fired. And that's how we always went at everything. It was a we, not a me. And you got a lot of that from the best coach maybe ever in college football, wanting for everybody else to get better under his watch. That's why you see 17 years of ability to sustain that success over a long period of time. And anybody that left from under Nick, you brought some of that with you.
A good way to measure that success, too, is what we've seen in the NFL draft. He coached 49 first-rounders, 44 at Alabama. That's more losses than he suffered in the 17 seasons. It's nuts. We want to show you this tweet that came out from Coach Prime yesterday. It's been making its rounds. I'm sure you've seen it. He said the game has changed so much that it chased the GOAT away, saying that the sport needs to hold up a mirror. So guys, if the sport, as Deion Sanders says, quote, chase the GOAT away, what is the potential coaching fallout with this changing landscape in college football? We saw the first domino fall in Nick Saban. What's the next, Smoke?
Well, you're going to have a lot of really good coaches not wanting to coach football anymore just because of the current structure that we're in. With the transfer portal, basically being able to jump in and jump out whenever you wanted to. And now you have to be on 365, 66 in a leap year of recruiting. And you're never off. So those 6 weeks that we used to have off in the summertime is not there anymore. So maybe this fallout will help the NCAA have a proper structure and understand they're human beings and they need some time off to be family men and also get some energy to recharge to come back, because this current model that we have right now, it's not sustainable for a 3 to 4 year, for a 5 to 10 year period, much less 3 years, without getting burned out.
Yeah, more than likely accelerated what we saw with Nick Saban, his departure, and a guy that, if this was traditional college football, what we saw over the last couple of years before it changed and the transfer portal and NIL, Nick Saban would probably be in it. I mean, you heard John talk about him going through his process up until 5 minutes before the meeting. The reality is you hear rumors out there and you hear them every year. Kirby Smart linked to the Atlanta Falcons, Kalen DeBoer linked to the Seattle Seahawks. That stuff might not happen, but it's realer than ever, right? These guys are saying, we can't sustain this. Like Smoke said, this calendar, 365 days out of the year, it's not just putting a board together. It's not just going out there and game planning and scheming it up. Guess what? I have to have meetings with some of the top players on my team, everybody in the 2 deep, and I got to figure out how much to pay these guys. Does that sound like fun? Does that sound enjoyable? It's exhausting. You talk to every single player personnel director out there, and they're saying, I wish I could do what you do. Why am I doing this? Sure, I make X amount of money. Financially, I'm well off. I'm still pulling my hair out at the end of the day. So imagine what that's like for the Kirby Smarts of the world that have to go through this year in and year out. And you talk about, Coach Sanders said it, looking at yourself in the mirror. I think it's been a lot of self-reflection for these coaches. By the time they get done with the year, Kirby Smart, 12-1, didn't win a national championship this year, and it feels like a failure. Yeah. And then you got to go out there and you got to you got to figure out how to retain your best players. I don't know how long I'd want to do that either, regardless of how good the money is. So that's where these guys are at. I don't blame them at all. The NCAA has a huge problem, and it's going to continue to be a young man's game, and less talented people are going to continue to get these jobs because all the good coaches are saying, you know what, this is not for me, I'm going to go somewhere else.
I can tell you, Cooper, guy that got out, me, just because of that schedule. Yeah. I wanted to be around my wife and my kids. That current schedule, I'm 43, I might look like I'm 50, but I know I probably would have aged 15 years and probably would have got burnt out even more. After that June, I wanted nothing to do with football. Mm-hmm. After that December calendar fell through, you're looking like, when am I going to get a chance to come up and breathe? If I was 72 years old, yeah, I'd probably be out of it too.
Yeah, we've done a great job of selling this job, so who wants it? We talked to John earlier in the show. He mentioned the candidates. Everybody's doing that today, just throwing some names at the wall. Nobody really knows. You can try to read the tea leaves as much as possible, but we all do know that the next head coach will have absolutely impossible shoes to fill. So I want to know from your perspective, what temperament and what skill set is needed to have success replacing the GOAT?
Humility, right? And let me tell you why, because you just heard it from John. Nick Saban's going to be in that building, which means his fingerprints are still there all over that program. And that's probably somebody that you are going to have to answer to at the end of the day. So it's going to take an individual who's going to say, let me put my ego aside and understand that I have an opportunity to learn from the greatest coach of all time. And guess what? I'm going to need him. If I'm going to be successful at this place where no matter what I do, I'm going to be compared to Nick Saban, then I'm going to need the help of guess who? Nick Saban, right? So you talk about humility. What is humility? It's the ability to take constructive criticism, right? So you think about those names out there. Steve Sarkisian is really highly regarded under Nick Saban. Kalen DeBoer, a guy, you talk to him as genuine of a human being as you'll meet as well. Some other names out there, I don't know. I think the list is going to be super short, but I think it's going to have to be a guy that can look in the mirror and say, you know what? I don't know if I'm ready for this job. It's going to be drinking through a fire hose. I need all the help that I can get, but I'm ready for the challenge as well.
Well, if you look at any one of Nick Saban's guys that come from underneath his tree, the ones that's been really successful, the ones that don't want to be like Nick, but want to take a piece of what Nick's done and add it onto their repertoire. So whoever comes in, you don't want to be like the exact thing that just replaced, that you're trying to replace, because you're never, ever going to amount to the success that Nick's had. So you want a guy to come in there that understand what the structure of that Alabama train that's been rolling for so long is, understand that they can put their piece of it on there, and if they get questioned, that they can have some answers to it. But like you said, humility, but also be humble. Understand that if you lose 2 games, yeah, they're going to start screaming for your head in Tuscaloosa, saying, oh, we should fire him. But understand that's happened to the guy that you're replacing as well, too. And you're just trying to learn how to get better. So it's going to take a real coach to understand that you're still going to get coached and be humble. And don't try to be Jolly St. Nick, but just be a version of what Nick's left. And that's when you're going to get your proper coach in position to take this thing and keep on moving. Again, this machine is well oiled and put together for another 3 to 4 year run. If the person that's coming in, don't go in and try to mess this thing up, my opinion.
You got to have that right balance of the humility, but also the confidence to be able to come in and take the keys from Nick Saban. It takes a lot to be able to do that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Thank you, guys. A big piece of the fallout now, though, is what happens to the best roster in the nation per the 247 Sports Talent Composite. Well, Grace Remington is with our portal expert, Chris Hummer. Hey, guys.
Yeah, Emily, I was about to say the coaching dominoes aren't the only ones we're waiting to fall. This roster could be picked apart. Chris Hummer, our transfer portal expert, joins me with more. Now, we know the rule, anytime a coach leaves the program, that opens a 30-day window for current players on the roster to transfer out of the program. The catch-22 of that is if Alabama has an exodus, they can't replace those players until April, when the second transfer portal window opens. So walk us through what this process might look like, and how do you think it'll impact Alabama in 2024?
Well, it's an interesting time for Alabama. Classes have started around the country at a lot of schools. So in that way, it is a good time for Alabama to make this change because it's harder for a player to leave and transfer immediately and enroll somewhere else. So that's a positive for Alabama. At the same time, it's very difficult for Alabama to replace anybody who leaves, at least until April. Not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things when you look towards the 2024 season. There are going to be more players who enter the portal. But Alabama already missed a very big first wave of players who were interested in going other places. So that pool of players is off the table if those players leave. So retention is going to be a key for Alabama over the next couple of days, over the next couple of weeks, as that 30-day window goes about. And like people are already like trying to poach. Like it's just the reality of the situation. I know somebody close to an Alabama player that received multiple phone calls last night in the wake of the Nick Saban news, and I'm sure it's a very similar situation for a lot of players. So it's going to be a very interesting couple weeks for the new head coach when they come in, because I would say his first and his main priority is going to be retention. It's not going to be recruiting 2025. It's going to be retaining the roster. That's the key. Alabama's a national title quality roster. They have to keep that roster intact.
Yeah, and that 2023 roster ranked as the top roster in our 247 Sports talent composite rankings. It was actually the highest rated ever in the history of our composite rankings. So which players do you think are a possibility to be poached?
Well, I would say off the top, I talked to somebody in the program today. They think for the most part, players are going to stick around at least until the new head coach gets there. Part of Nick Saban's message to players was like, give us 72 hours. Let's see what we can come up with. Like that was the idea of the meeting. And I think just talking to people around that program over the last 24 hours, there is a sense team leaders have rallied the program and kids will mostly stay put for now. That said, there are a lot of Alabama players during the last transfer portal window that considered their options. I think a really good example here is Caden Proctor, true freshman All-American left tackle, one of the best players in the 2023 class. He is somebody that was considering his options as a possible transfer following the Rose Bowl. Those are conversations that happened. That was a pretty aggressive rumor there. He ultimately stayed, but now he has a full 30-day window to consider his options again. And you could say that about every single player on Alabama's roster. And from that perspective, you're going to have basically every single player on Alabama's roster as a potential starter elsewhere. Like the people in Alabama's 3 deep could start most places in the Power 5. So you're going to have a lot of teams coming after them. So it's just going to be critical for Alabama to manage that as much as they can. And
it's not just the game day experience players that can transfer out. Members of this 2024 recruiting class that ranks number 2 in the country currently could also leave. There are 21 current enrollees at Tuscaloosa right now. We've already seen a verbal decommit from 5-star wide receiver Ryan Williams. And it was interesting reading his quotes because he said when Bama lost the wide receiver coach, didn't affect him as much. But he was shocked to hear the Saban news. He said, now that's a legacy you're losing. So it's a little bit more poignant to these guys. What do you expect to see from the 2024 players?
Well, it's just an interesting time for them, and I've used the word interesting a couple times. And it's frankly not just interesting. This is unprecedented in college football. You've never had a coach of this stature leave at a time like this. There's never been a time in college football history when a coach of Nick Saban's stature and his historical significance in the game has left, and his players have the opportunity to do so as well. College football rules have been restrictive for a long time, and now it kind of works against Alabama that so many players enrolled early because they can just hop in the portal and leave with no approval from Alabama. They don't have to get out of their national letter of intent. So these players have a lot of flexibility. If you're Alabama, like a guy like Julian Saban, their 5-star quarterback take from this class, he's from California, came to Alabama in part to play for Nick Saban like so many of these guys do. You have to hang on to him. Like he is an out-of-region player. Alabama was able to get Julian Saban in large part because of what Alabama has built. Now that 2024 class, just like the rest of the roster, has the opportunity to leave. And Alabama, again, like retention is the word of the day for Alabama moving forward. You have to retain your roster. And they're going to have to fight to keep a lot of these guys.
Retention is key. That's a phrase you keep repeating, and that depends on several factors. One of them is the way Alabama handles its NIL. They do it a little differently than most schools, typically merit-based for the young guys. So how important is it for Alabama to get the NIL together to keep this roster?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about NIL with Alabama. Nick Saban has had a pretty significant way of molding that program. He wanted it to be merit-based. I think that works in large sense because Nick Saban was there. You know, if you go to Alabama, you compete for a national championship. Now that that piece of things is out the window, you think you're probably going to compete for a national championship with that roster, but it's not a guarantee. Now Alabama's going to have to fundraise a little more aggressively from NIL. They're going to have to be a little more aggressive in the NIL landscape because you cannot rely on Nick Saban to hold things together in that way. So it'll be very interesting to see how Alabama managed to activate that side of things. There are very aggressive schools out there from an NIL standpoint. I think about Oregon, I think about Texas, I think about Miami. Alabama isn't necessarily in that stratosphere yet in terms of NIL, and they'll have to be soon to keep this roster intact, I think.
There's a lot of moving pieces. Thank you, Chris. Our entire team is keeping you up to date with all the Alabama news. Head over to 247sports.com for transfer portal news, crystal ball predictions, player grades, and the latest around the entire college football world. That's 247sports.com. Emily, back to you.
Thank you, Grace and Chris. We're going to finish with our final thoughts, and I have to ask this because if we're being honest with ourselves, there were a lot of fan bases yesterday, particularly in the SEC, respectfully celebrating this retirement yesterday. So, Smoke, I'll ask you, who benefits most from Nick Saban leaving the sport of college football?
Well, let's start off in the SEC. Every SEC school is running around doing backflips. Every average recruiter that never been on their game for a long period of time, they got a chance now. The school that was 7 wins and you had to play Bama, knowing that was that was an L, you got a shot now to get to 8 or 9. So every school in the SEC got a shot. The rest of America, in terms of the national landscaping recruiting, now have a realistic opportunity of keeping your hometown talent, not going down to Tuscaloosa. So SEC and the rest of college football, they're doing backflips because they now understand that one of the 4 teams that we'd always pencil in, like who's winning the national championship this year? Well, Bama. Now, whatever team gets an opportunity to slide on into that slot.
I'm going to be a little bit more specific within the SEC. I'm going to go with Georgia. How about Kirby Smart? How about the monster that Nick Saban created, right? You think about his pathway now to a college football playoff and a championship. You're talking about a team that won 2 consecutive national championships, one of the only teams for the first time in a long time since Minnesota, I think in the 40s or something like that, trying to win 3 straight. So what about Georgia? They are not falling off. They are full steam ahead. You talk about Kirby Smart. You talk about his appetite for recruiting. Another guy that I'm super high on. How about Dan Lanning? He's staying in Oregon. He said the grass is greener in Eugene. He's kind of foaming at the mouth. He's excited. He's pumped up. They're moving to the Big Ten. I think those 2 dudes right there are absolutely maniacal in terms of recruiting. And you got some other guys out there that really love to recruit as well, but they have the structure. They understand kind of what it takes. You talk about that Saban tree and kind of what it looks like. I think those 2 are the best of what Nick Saban has created. So you talk about 2 guys looking to take advantage of an opportunity, not having to go through the GOAT anymore. I'm looking at Kirby Smart and I'm looking at Dan Lanning.
I got one for you. How about our guy down in Florida State?
Yeah.
If Nick would have retired last year, they wouldn't have got 60 burgered in the Orange Bowl.
I'm telling you, it should be interesting. And the fact that the SEC is doing away with divisions, too, you would think the West would benefit more from this. Well, there's no East and no more West. Everyone is talking about the legacy, and it's easy to sum it up. 7 national championships, 11 SEC titles. The numbers are there. But from the perspective of 2 guys who have really dedicated their adult lives to the sport of football, Coop, I'll start with you. How has Nick Saban changed the game?
Where to start, right? I mean, I think the biggest thing with him that maybe a lot of people don't realize, he's an innovator, right? You think about Alabama and what people think of the Alabama program. Everything that happened in college sports, especially in football, typically happened after Alabama made the first move on the chessboard, right? If Nick Saban didn't make a move, that means nobody else could make a move. We're waiting to see what Alabama is going to do. What is Alabama going to do when it comes to their 4th quarter program? What is Alabama going to do when it comes to organizing their recruiting department? What is Alabama going to do in the NIL space? People wanted to follow Nick Saban. It was natural. He was this de facto presence on top of the mountaintop in all of college football. And without him gone, there's going to be big shoes to fill. And I'm looking for somebody to kind of step into that and kind of say, all right, I'm next. I'm going to be creative, innovative, and this is the program that you need to follow the lead of.
Well, when you look at it, there's a few things that I'm going to get real specific with. Recruiting. Having ideals. You know about that big Bible that our guy Nick got. He has the ability to say, okay, if it's not a 6'4 DB, we don't want him, or a 6'1 guy. So he had ideals. Fired Coaches Association. They all showed up at Nick's door. And he splashed that holy water on them at the end of the day. And you had the Mike Loxleys, the Sarks, the Lane Kiffins, Coach Jones, all of those guys end up being coaches again once they've gotten fired. We all understand that Nick is the guy that splashed the holy water on them and sent them back off to start their careers back over.
I love it. Thank you both so much for your perspective. As always, you can get this guy's perspective, Cooper Petagna, on the Football Recruiting Podcast with his friend Andrew Ivins. Tune in Tuesday and Wednesday at 5 o'clock Eastern on the 247 Sports YouTube page. Another reminder on the way out, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.